Welcome to the Future Media Podcast. I'm Ricky Sutton.
And I'm Alan Chappell. And this podcast goes deep into the collision of big tech
and the future of the world.
We explore how companies like Google, Meta, and Apple are impacting each of our lives.
I'm an investigative journalist.
I'm a privacy lawyer.
And every week we speak with experts to bring the unreported details into the light.
Welcome to the second part of our long and sweeping interview with the former head of Google News and the Google News Initiative, Richard Gingras. In part one, he admitted that the Google News Initiative was ineffective, branded SEO a waste of money, and warned publisher traffic was about to get a whole lot worse due to the splinternet. It was really quite something to hear an exec from one of the highest offices in Google be so open. Now, part two, where we begin by asking whether Google's 3 crushing monopoly losses will change anything. You see, it's easy to believe that Google owns the open web in 2025. Search, Chrome, ads, and YouTube are the 4 legs of a table that holds up almost everything that more than 4 billion people read and watch every day. But Gingras, perhaps unsurprisingly, pushes back. It was the internet that changed everything by widening choice, he says. Google just organized it. And the true story of publishing's demise, he argues, is that news recklessly lost its trust and relevance with its audiences. And while he's sympathetic to journalism's civic role, he's blunt on its economics. News has little or no commercial value, he says, because advertisers just don't want it. Nor did the public revolt when Google throttled news in Australia and Canada during regulatory standoffs. That, he says, sent a very loud signal to the Googleplex. Now, he's quit Google now, and he's trying to find a solution, and his remedy is in local news. He believes that a new fat middle of moderate service-first outlets will emerge, which can cool the temperature and rebuild habit for readers. The web, he says, didn't set out to break news. Publishing's own missteps and its failure to protect reader trusts did the damage. This is part 2 of an almost 2-hour podcast where he tears a band-aid off one of the most debated topics in news over the past quarter century. Did Google kill news? Not us, he says. You did it to yourself. The challenge then becomes, I know it's hard, but the responsibility at Google to think what that means, and the implications that means for 5 billion people must be enormous.
And I think it's looked at that way. Now, again, my experience at Google was entirely on the product side or on policy matters and efforts relating to news, right? Not that I don't understand other dynamics of what was going on. I think, again, there's a whole lot more nuance to what you said than I think you suggested. But when I look at, for instance, the search engine, particularly the search engine, and when people say, you control, you're the gateway to people's knowledge for news. And I go, yeah, not really, right? I mean, basically, the internet has given people more choice and diversity than ever before. And in my work with regard to news, that was the objective. That was the objective. I've been saying this to people lately, and I know they say, like, basically, you work at Google, you got the taint, you drank the Kool-Aid. I never worked in my entire career with more thoughtful, principled people than I worked with in Google Search. They fully recognized the challenges, and it was constant change, right? When it comes to ranking, the mission's never accomplished. The environment changes, the culture changes, what people put on the web changes, how people manage their websites change, who's trying to trick us with SEO. And so it's the good guys and the bad guys who are trying to trick us. It's an ongoing challenge. I mean, we're going to open up at the beginning with the birth of Google News. The birth of Google News was Krishna Bharat, a brilliant engineer out of India, came to the United States, studied at Georgia Tech, came to Google. 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, it was like, gee, I would like to have a broader sense of this story from around the world than what I'm getting just in my domain. And that was the idea of Google News, is like, can I bring all those perspectives and sources into place such that people have access to them, right? And there was brilliance to that. There was brilliance to a lot of the work done, that some of it that I was involved in. I'm not trying to take credit, because I worked with people who are all way smarter than I am. We would look at, like, okay, we see a news query. What do we do with that? How do we give people both the latest news? How do we adjust for our sense of what the depth of knowledge is on a story for a given user, right? Some are following the story intently, and what they want is the latest news. Some don't know. So we think, like, can we find an explainer? Can we find background interviews for people to access? All these pivots, and you now see that in search, pivots, to kind of help different dimensions and vectors of the query, because we don't know exactly what the user's intent is, what their knowledge state is. Our approach to the original program. There's a lot of great work there. So I kind of grimace when people say, "Oh, you're the gateway to the internet." One thing I just say is, like, look, one thing about Google search that is not true for the most part of algorithms in the rest of society, including, for instance, social, but also health, police, so on and so forth. But with Google search, we show the results of every query to you. We show our work, not only the first page, but the following 100 pages, if you want to. And it's available for people to analyze. And we always encouraged academic research, because for the most part, it was either giving us useful criticism, or it was bearing out what we were saying, was that actually we were doing a pretty good job of surfacing that kind of diversity around queries. And diversity really mattered, because the one thing Google could never afford to do, and we knew this, our reputation is sacred. I shouldn't say Google's reputation is sacred. The degree of trust in Google is huge. So one thing we concluded is, like, we can't ever be seen as having an editorial perspective.
How does everything that you've said over the last 2 or 3 minutes jibe up against last summer's experiment with news in Europe? Wasn't there a period of time where Google basically shut off news, or shut off search going to news sites?
Yes, we've done several of those experiments. We did some of those experiments in Australia around the time of the bargaining code. We did those experiments in Canada during the policy battles around C-18. One reason for doing them, frankly, was we wanted our own best assessment of what would happen if news wasn't part of it, right? Because the Canadian government, as was the case with the bargaining code, but the Canadian with C-18 basically said, you no longer have fair use to news links and headlines. You can't go there. And what I told God, I was deeply involved with that. And I remember I went to Ottawa and I said, this is a mistake. I can tell you what will happen. I can tell you that Facebook will pull out because news doesn't matter to them at all. And they did. And by the way, user satisfaction went up. Engagement did not go down, right? And I say, you're creating a demotivation for Google to do what we've always done, which is, how do we provide as many links into a story as possible? If you're saying now we have to pay for the value of every link, well, that's not going to be a great motivating interest for us to do that. And so we did those tests. In fact, I went to Canada when we did that test in Canada. And I went up there knowing that we're about to start the test. And I went up there to be there on that first day to explain things to the government. Guess what? And because we figured it would be noticed right away. And as we did test for, I don't know, I think it was 2 to 3% of the population. It didn't get noticed for 10 days, which is its own interesting message.
So if I take that to, if you're right, and that's what the data says, I'm going to challenge it in a minute, but I will just ask quickly, if that's right, and if that's what the data says, we're saying that news has no value to consumers. That's what your data is telling you.
First of all, it's not just our data. Go to the Reuters Institute stuff. I mean, Rasmus Nielsen would hit on this point consistently.
Is that the conclusion?
I'll say several things about it. One, as I said, you can look at a lot of third-party research, and I think the Reuters Institute has just done consistently excellent research on this over the years, right? And it's their conclusion that in any society around the world, the percentage of the society that's interested in what we would call serious news, right, not sports, is down in the single digits. And I don't think this is terribly uncommon. I think that was true back in the days of newspapers, for that matter. Again, it was about the sports section and the style section, not the front section. So, the percentage is low. I told you our percentage with regard to queries. Now, it's even less. I think one of the reasons for that is Google search is so useful on so many daily functional things that you come to it every day for those daily functional things. Whereas news is kind of a haphazard, less, more intermittent interest where you need to go to search for it. And as you know, on the monetization side, there's one of the things you do learn at Google is the value of different areas of content, which we could interpret towards in the value of the query. What is the economic value of a news query, for instance, versus a travel query? Value of a news query is negligible. It's like almost zero. In fact, I think it is. If you're rounding error, it would be zero. You look at a travel query, actually, a lot of value there. Ads there, people looking for different things to travel for a vacation. I think, for instance, when it comes to creating AI solutions, there's going to be content licensed. In the area of travel, you're going to say, yeah, we can see the revenue we're going to have. We know we need good travel information. We need the relationships with the booking engines and so on and so forth, and we'll make that happen, right? But if you go on the other side to news, it's like it's the absence of commercial value.
I'm going to move on to the future in a minute, but I just want to close out this conversation because I know you're clearly very smart, and I know you've spent an awful lot of time thinking about this, and you've had access to data that Alan and I haven't. But what I would say is that word value is the core question here. If the value is measured as money, you're right. If the value is measured as society, you're fundamentally wrong. And so I think that is a real challenge because, I would argue, I was going to say one might argue, but I'll put my name down on this one. I think the reason that your political situation is so utterly broken is because you've silenced voices and because there isn't information being spread that challenges the narrative that you're this or that. The world isn't a 1 or a 0. It's not right or left. It's a million different things. I've been a war correspondent. I've sat in wars. I've spoken to both sides of those warring factions, and both of them are 100% believe they're right, but they're not. They are a version of right based on a perspective. And I think if you create a situation where value is measured by money, that's a different issue. But if you also, I've run an AI company, I founded an AI company, so I'm a maths guy. If you allow the numbers to make a decision and determine what's valuable because of what a person clicks, then that's the equivalent of giving everybody in the world a pen and expecting them to be Shakespeare. It eventually breaks.
But wait a second. I'm not saying that news doesn't have or journalism doesn't have societal value, nor would Sundar Pichai. I did say it doesn't have commercial value in the marketplace of information, and that's not about search. That's in general. You can see that. Obviously, as I pointed out, you've got news organizations that used to make a whole lot of money off of soft content. They can't make it anymore because of the competition of the internet, and they're left with just news, and it's hard to monetize. No question. The fact that it had no commercial value didn't stop us from investing a lot in trying to do the right thing. Now, your other point of policy problems, if you say it's about blocking voices, I'd like to go there because I'm not sure what you mean. To me, frankly, the trigger to the policy problem is a rather simple one, right? The newspaper industry was disrupted. And the newspaper industry in any country has way more political influence than Google, right? I mean, I look at the bargaining code legislations that come about in the world. The European Copyright Directive. Where did that come from? That was driven by Axel Springer, a very sophisticated publisher, a very sophisticated player in the political sphere. Similarly with News Corp. In fact, if there's a weakness of Google in the policy sphere, and I've said this, is that Google we're a bunch of logicians, right? I mean, I remember having to brief Larry about the first link text, the one in Germany, Lieschenschutz, right? And I got to page 3, and he kind of looked, "Well, this just makes no sense." And I said, "You're right. From a structural perspective, it makes no sense. But the policy environment isn't about logic. Logic typically doesn't get invited into the room, doesn't get access to the microphone. It's competition of interests. And as I pointed out, in any country on earth, there's far more political weight and influence in the publishing industry than there is with Google. Now, that can be good, that can be bad, that can be indifferent."
I think that was true, but isn't true anymore, if I'm honest.
I'm sure it's diminishing. I mean, this was an observation that hit me last fall. I mean, again, it's not that I'm smart. I'm just old and I've been around a long time, and you keep, learning things along the way. I was in Berlin last October or so, and I was going to dinner with a friend of mine who actually happened to work for Axel Springer for the years. She doesn't anymore. We were walking to dinner, and what struck me was there are no newsstands anymore on the streets of Berlin. None. Right? Evaporated. And that's not unique to Germany or Berlin. But yeah, but I realized what Axel Springer lost, right? Bild is the largest circulation newspaper in Europe, the largest circulation newspaper in Germany, the most influential newspaper in Germany, a tabloid that had blaring headlines every day, right? And on those newsstands was the blaring headline of Bild. You didn't have to buy Bild. You didn't have to read Bild. You didn't even have to respect Bild to that message to be put into your head. They had this massively influential, in a sense, billboard network across Germany simply based on their presence on newsstands. And that disappeared. So not surprisingly, companies like News Corp and Axel Springer, their influence has been diminished. To your point, right? Things are diminishing because they don't have the mechanisms that they had before, right? I often look at those political battles by News Corp and Axel Springer and others. I don't say this to be critical. It's just, is really was a war against the internet, right? Because the internet created a far more competitive environment, far more voices. But go back to censorship, because or I should say, limiting access to voices, because I honestly am not sure what the
I think the internet has silenced voices. I'll explain why.
The internet can't silence anyone. So be specific, right? I mean, it's an open protocol. You can put up a website, and maybe in your country, maybe no one will let you put up a website.
No, I hear your point. I think that what I'm going to say to you, I'm going to try and explain this succinctly, but it is complicated, so I want to try and nail it exactly. 52% of all the world's newspapers have closed in the last decade. So I think 58% of all journalists are gone. Now, many of them have turned up again as bloggers, to your point, and I understand, and we can talk about that. I'm one of them. But I think that where we've created a challenge is that by removing the commercial structures that enable a professional media organization to run, which has checks and balances and rules and editors, we've avoided the kind of anarchy of information where anything can get published and accentuated, because newspapers kept it to what was legal, I ought to not say newspapers. I mean the news industry, okay, in general. It has rules around defamation. It has rules around contempt. It has rules around national identity. It has all manners of rules. And so the news that was published previously, 15 years ago, met a whole series of structures. And it wasn't polarized then, because I can remember that in my news organization, page 1 might be a big scoop, page 3 might be something entertainment, page 6 would be the prime minister, page 8 would be the leader of the opposition. We had all of the narratives being spoken effectively in one package. And the outcome of that was the people knew what they were getting, and they knew that they could rely on it, and they knew they could trust it. And as a result, we had a more informed discourse on the most difficult decisions that exist. And I'll give you another example. So I used to run video at the Sydney Morning Herald. You just mentioned them earlier on. And the one of the board members came to me one day and said, I've bought mobile phones for every single reporter, okay, so they can shoot video of everything, okay? And I said, well, that's brilliant, but why don't we just give all the readers a pen and see what newspaper we end up with, right? You end up with chaos. Sometimes you don't need more. What you just need is refinement. And if you then give everybody access to everything, you end up with anarchy. And that is what I worry we're headed to, and why we're now seeing a splintering of the web.
A couple of small points, because I really would like to get to the bigger question you have there. I'm not sure I buy the notion that in the world of print there was, quotes, less polarization or partisanship on the part of newspapers. I mean, my experience in looking at the tabloid newspapers in London 30, 40 years ago, as well as New York, was you pretty much had a clue as to what their position was, the Daily Mail versus the Independent, blah, 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 right?
Here in New York, nobody liked George Steinbrenner. Oh, I'm sorry. Until they won a World Series, and then they kind of liked him a little bit more.
That is indeed true. But that's a minor point, and that's looking backward. Like, it's really about how do we look forward. I'd also say on the kind of, as you said, 58% fewer journalists. One thing also you got to look at there. I remember someone saying that to me who worked at the San Jose Mercury News, and he said, like, they had a newsroom of 600 people and now they got 150. I said, well, wait a second now, just to be kind of just straight and factual, you had people writing movie reviews, you had people writing, food columns, all of this, again, soft content for the soft sections. And they've obviously moved off because newspapers, cut their staffs, to your point. But many of them went to other, niche publications on the net. So they're not necessarily not journalists. But I don't want to make too much of a point of that, because your core message is a fair one, is how does society at large, through various mechanisms, support the role of the press, of the journalistic press, in the serious areas where we think that's crucial for the democracy or an open society? I think that's a very fair question. I think the answers are kind of complex. I think some of the answers are potentially problematic. We held one of our, in this case, CNTI, the Policy Research Institute that I helped found with Maria and Marty Barron. We held an unconference recently, and I gave the opening remarks, and my point was, again, be careful of the false messiahs. Philanthropy isn't going to support this. Government funding isn't going to support it. And if it does, by the way, beware, because I know that.
I agree.
I know that degree quite well. That's kind of dangerous. Public policy isn't going to save us from things. I mean, my own father-in-law spent a year in prison and had his extraordinarily successful screenwriting career blacklisted for 15 years, right? Because of the, Hollywood witch hunt for communists in late 1940s. And the reason he was put in jail was when he was asked the question of whether or not he had certain political beliefs, he pled the First Amendment and not the Fifth, thinking that he had a right to his political beliefs, and Congress couldn't inquire that of him. Well, he was held in contempt, he was found guilty, and guess what? The Supreme Court didn't overturn it. And the point I made is, the courts didn't stop the blacklist. Public policy didn't stop the blacklist. Over time, it was more noble leadership and revised public opinion that wasn't driven to simply fear people for their political beliefs, that might have been more left or more right than what you would like.
Amazing. I agree. Do you know what? This is what I love. We started out with the conversation with me saying that because I've worked on the tech side, because I've worked on the AI side, because I've worked on the journalism side and a senior role in each, my job is to try and stitch together this kind of a broken narrative into some bridge to the future that's better for everyone. And what we've done is that I could spend years locked in a room with you and discuss this, and I would be as happy as a clown. All right. But we have to try and break this down into easy, bite-sized, understandable chunks for our audience. You and I should definitely keep talking. But what I think is vital here is that the world is better off if we all move together collectively. The North Star is the same for everyone. We need to try and find a way to get to a better future together. A broken internet, a splinternet feels bad to me. It feels like a retrograde step. I think that the mass commercialization of absolutely everything on the open web has its own damages. I think that the plurality of voices without rules and broken international laws that are different everywhere causes chaos and madness. And plural and effectively polarization is the result of not having pluralization. So all of these things be true. So what do we do about it? What do we do? What's the future? You asked a couple of times that you wanted to talk about village media. You think that you've got a model there that you think works. What do you think is the best way to get to this kind of hopeful future?
I kind of don't lean too hard on the notion that somehow we all have to come together as society and rah go forward. Because I just not see it. I don't see it's kind of practical. I don't see how it happens.
I'm talking not about every person. I'm talking about the tech industry and the media industry. I think there needs to be an alignment of vision.
And I think there could be in fact, I think there's, again, one of the things I don't like the phrase big tech. I don't like the phrase platforms because it's a simplistic meme, right? I've always said, like, well, if you want to talk about specific dimensions of the tech industry, let's do so, right? Because there are myriad companies. What do we mean by platforms? Search is a very distinct and different thing from a social network, is a very distinct thing from how Apple manages their walled garden, so on and so forth and so on. If you look at individual companies, obviously they have very different views. But I think Google, frankly, and people can disagree, I think always was always much more thoughtful about being willing to collaborate. Now, unfortunately, that has obviously been much harder the last several years. Because, even at Google is saying, like, well, gee, we keep trying to do things, but the 2x4s keep coming at our heads. How do we get comfortable with that? But back to solutions. I do believe that when I look at polarized environments, it is about trying to build a fatter middle. And so I think about that in several ways, and I'll get to Village in a minute because I think that's really an interesting model. But in that regard is, our media entities themselves. As you said, we've got some extreme partisan media entities. Can we have more media entities who have a philosophy and objective to reach across the spectrum? Right. And some of that, by the way, and some of the stuff isn't even intentional. I say, like, if you really research the lack of trust, you come away with certain kinds of insights. Some say, well, these news organizations are pretty damn arrogant. They keep arrogant. They kill us what they think we need to hear or what we need to believe. Right. Maybe we need to be more humble in how we approach it. Can we be better in providing context about things? It bleeds, it leads. Okay, fine. There were 2 murders in Brooklyn last night. Is that part of a dangerous trend or is that an anomaly? Maybe it'd be helpful to know, right? Because otherwise it drives silos of fear. Linguistics, people studying linguistics and news. A woman in Florida doing excellent research. For instance, she did excellent research on the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis. And she said, across the board, the protesters had these interesting pairings of words like ignite, erupt, explode. And she says subconscious. And actually, if you look back at, it's a common thing to say the protests erupted, the protest ignited. But that also is a term of conflict. It might suggest that the protests weren't peaceful when actually they were. Right. And as you know, politicians spend immense amounts of money on linguistics. What exactly phrases and word pairings will work? So maybe in journalism, we should be thinking about that as well. Right.
The New York Times drives me crazy with that.
Precisely.
And I'm a loyal subscriber and I want to support them. But
exactly. I'll give you an example which drove me up the wall recently. Like, we got this interesting situation where this administration is bringing troops into cities based on this perception of high crime in those cities. Someone pointed out, not someone, you can look at the data, that said, well, if you look at the crime in Chicago versus the crime in, say, Houston or Jacksonville, it's not at all the same. It's much higher in those cities. right? There was an article in a local publication in Chicago that reported that data, and it was like really useful to report that data. The headline they put on it was, "Sorry, Trump, you're wrong." And well, great, that's effective. You just turned off 43% of the population of Chicago, which isn't going to go beyond the headline because they think you're fake news because you're expressing that sharp partisanship. So I mean, I do think as journalists, we need to kind of step back and say, how do we approach these things differently? How do we approach these differently given the different world that we're living in? But now switching to local, Village Media over the course of years has just continued to refine the whole notion of what can a local media entity be to its community. And the word community is important, right? The cities that Village is in are communities. They're not all villages. It might be a community of 80,000 people. It might be working class. A community to us is a section of a major metropolitan area, right? We have Toronto today, which is just the downtown core where 300,000 people live and work. And what Toronto today covers is just that area, right? We're very conscious of assessing what are the information needs of a community. And by the way, when you look at it, what you find is, first of all, people's information needs are proportionate to geographic proximity. I want to know what's going on in my neighborhood. And by the way, a lot of what I want to know is like, who's fixing the potholes? By the way, there was a snowstorm last night, or the school's going to close. What's going on in the community park this weekend? Oh, new restaurant opening. Can I afford it? Right? So as a result, Village puts a huge focus on what people call service journalism, which are those categories. It's not the watchdog journalism, it's everything else. We do watchdog journalism, but we do everything else as well. I think a better phrase for service journalism is cohesion journalism because it creates the shared reality, right? We all care about the potholes. We all have very different perspectives about the political issues, all right? And you can look at research. There's a lot of research on this that says if you want to help the community engage on controversial issues, then make sure you build your trust on non-controversial topics, right? And so that's the editorial focus of Village says, do right by service journalism, do right by watchdog journalism, do it with impartiality. We don't do endorsements, for instance. And don't be afraid to celebrate the community's hopes and dreams. You're not just a town scold, right? So you're covering the heartwarming story about the older woman who's looking for a lost love. Great. Right? You do that stuff. And by the way, the result of that is very deep engagement. In villages, more mature cities, 25% of the population visits almost every day, right? The second component of the model, there are 5 components of it, but they all hook together in a really marvelous way. The second component is what we call civic engagement. We have cares teams. Say, all right, let's build relationships with the local institutions. Whether that be the Kiwanis Club or the Chamber of Commerce or the big hospital or the government, right? And let's see how we work together to address problems. One of the things we like to do in communities is what we call random acts of kindness, right? The person loses their wheelchair van, and we step in and we work with the dealer and we work with, some others, and they bring together the money to buy a new wheelchair van, and we cover it because it shows how the community cares for each other, right? In fact, Village doesn't consider themselves a news media company anymore. We say we're a community impact organization, right? And we want to build the fabric of the community that both gives them the information and the opportunities to engage, right? And so all of these components are really important. The third component, which we introduced last year, is what we call Spaces, which is a community interest network. It's like Reddit for local, done with polish. And this feeds off of if you're familiar, the research of Robert Putnam, right, who did extraordinary research starting back 40 years ago in Italy, where Italy had shifted to provincial government, and after 10 years, some were working and some not, and he was brought in to do research to find what were the correlating factors. He wrote a brilliant book in the 90s called Bowling Alone, because the correlation he found was that people were no longer joining clubs, right? They were spending so much time watching television, watching the soccer game on Sunday, they didn't go on picnics. And he said, and the whole point was, if you want to have effective governance, you have to have communities which engage across the diversity of the community. So the whole approach with Spaces is really about hobbies and interests. Oh, you guys like maintaining classic cars. And guess what? There are people in the community who might be from indigenous tribes or French Quebec or English or moved here from India, and they're interested in classic cars. What a marvelous thing, right? We curate the topics. A topic we won't allow is neighborhood watch. Guess why? Because people say, "What about that person with the dark skin and the hoodie?" And we don't allow political conversations there. But the whole idea is, how do you do this in a non-toxic way, right? The fourth component is grow the economy, and that's the advertising. And there too, I mean, I can go into detail. Maybe I should stop, but it's very thoughtful in the ad products themselves. As an analyst put it recently when he said it, he says, "I see you've switched the model because we don't do subscriptions. It's free, no paywalls." He said, "You've switched the model such that merchants are subscribing to you because you give them access to the community and the market they serve. And at the local level, advertising is information. This isn't Exxon greenwashing. This is, I want to know, if you ask people, we did this big study in Chicago, what drives people to consume local news? The number one reason was save money. I want to know where the deals are. I want to know, can I afford that restaurant? Right? And that works. And that's what drives the business model. The fifth thing that we're now doing, and we're just starting doing this, is really to start exploring the notion of how do you pull those pieces together on important issues. We call it the community impact protocol at the moment, a real technical term. And it says, first of all, let's use our newsroom and research to identify what the community feels needs to be addressed. We're running one now where the issue was opioids in this working class city. We pulled together the stakeholders in the community for a day, all those involved in the opioid situation, to talk about what they were doing. That was operated by our CARES team. The newsroom reported on it, right? We report on it consistently. We're going to bring together, our version of citizen assemblies. How do we bring people together across the community to engage on the subject and interact with stakeholders? And we'll cover that as well. We'll continue to do research and see, are we having impact? The whole point is, can we, through not only the journalistic coverage, but by the mechanisms we use, empower communities to address their own challenges and strengthen the communities themselves? Someone had said when I talked to this, says, "You mean like solutions journalism?" I said, "No, not solutions journalism, because it's not us saying what the solution should be. It's how do we enable the community to solve the problems themselves, right?" And so, I mean, in a sense, what we're doing is, what is a modern, digital operating system for a community? That's an audacious thing to try to do, but frankly, if you look at your question of how do we evolve journalism to meet the needs of society, how do we involve and leverage journalism to bring polarized communities back together, there are things that we can do. And so that's what we're doing there. I mean, it's incredibly exciting. And why I left Google was I really wanted to kind of get my hands dirty in this stuff. And it's wonderfully exciting because, as you know, you are a product guy, is we're building things. I'm not spending time with politicians.
Look, we've kept you a very long time. I've got one last question. I just want to go back to something you mentioned earlier on, because it's actually the opposite of what I've heard. So I want to hear what your interpretation is. You said we need a fatter middle. Can you explain that for me, please?
In a highly polarized political environment, my sense is it's going to be hard to bring over the extremes. You want that moderate middle. People look at the United States, and I think often, they look at it and they say, "Oh gosh, those guys who voted for whoever." I'm not going to even bother to name names because I've tried to keep being apolitical. But did they vote for that person based on an extreme view? My sense is no. Many of them voted for it because they were, as ever, their pocketbooks. They were concerned about the nature of the economy. They had doubts about the effectiveness of government. Big surprise. A lot of people have doubts about the effectiveness of the government, right? So on and so forth, that caused them to vote because they didn't think who was in office was doing the right thing, right? And so that's what I say about the fat middle. Now, obviously, that requires also politicians who are also kind of willing to maybe move closer to the center. I don't think we're going to get ourselves out of this mess if we simply double down on the extremes.
What I'm seeing in the middle is that We have the big newspapers of record up here, the Wall Street Journals, the New York Times, the Washington Posts. These are all going to survive and thrive because they have sufficient infrastructure to build the subscriptions, events, and other monetization streams, the direct sales, all of that. They're going to survive. Then across the middle, and Alan and I have spoken to lots of people about this over the last couple of years, if you look at the Gannett's and you have a look at all of these other kind of middle market, effectively programmatic advertising funded local papers and regional papers that sit through the middle, they're the ones that are dying off fastest, right? Those are the ones that are ending fastest. And then at the other end of the equation, you've got all the reporters that have left all those newspapers that have gone out and started a Substack or started a podcast. And so now you've got a masses of media at this end and a massive media or mass media at this end, but the middle's dying. If the aim here is to have a fatter middle to create that plurality of to your point, to have more of that nuance in reporting, that's actually the piece that's dying fastest. That really feels like the objective, to try and save that.
It's dying for several reasons. One is, I think, a lack of vision. But I would also say, if you look at the major metropolitan dailies, I've always felt that they were the most vulnerable because they're no longer relevant for national news because you can get it from elsewhere, but they're not local enough to be relevant to the communities they serve. Right? You look at the Chicago Sun-Times. I know the Chicago Sun, it still exists. You know what its print circulation is? Like 30,000.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's gone, but that's why I think to me the unfortunate challenge about what we're doing with Village is like, how do you kind of spread that kind of concept fast and wide everywhere? Because I do think, as it's often said by the wiser politicians, all politics is local. And if you're not winning and bringing people together locally, you'll never do it nationally. In fact, the problem in our political space, I think, around the world is national has become so much more the driver because of all the things we know. It's much easier to drive memes at that level. It's much easier to drive fear at that level. So, I'd like to think major publications can help address that. But even the New York Times on its best day only serves a small portion of society, and so does Wall Street Journal. So I do think we have to reinvent things at the baseline. Obviously, that's not easy. But if you're really thorough in the analysis, I don't know how you come away with a different conclusion. And if so, I would love to know it because it's what I've spent too many decades trying to figure out.
Richard, this has been the longest and most thought-provoking podcast I've ever done. I thank you so much for volunteering so much of your time. I could genuinely talk to you for weeks. So I really appreciate you taking the time and talking to us. I'd dearly like to stay in touch.
I appreciate that. And I've also enjoyed the conversation. And I love having these conversations because, again, as I keep saying, I don't know all the answers, but in fact, I've told people, I was introduced once, I did commencement speeches and so on, and I said, Richard has all this knowledge and experience and he clearly knows all the answers. And I say, actually, that's not true. The main thing that's different between me and most folks is I've had many opportunities to make mistakes and learn from them. And it wasn't necessary that you learn the answers, but I said at the beginning, it's because you learn what better questions to ask.
That's not age, that's wisdom.
Exactly, just to do that. So, I'm glad to talk in whatever manner or form. And we didn't even talk about AI.
Oh, well, that's why we now have an excuse to have you back on.
Glad to do it.
Fantastic.
By the way, can I end with this, or are you guys literally out of time? No, you got
No.
All right.
One more.
I did this. I said we did this on conference, and we did T-shirts. I did a T-shirt. I came up with a T-shirt that said, I wish I wore it. It says, "I am artificially intelligent. Can you tell?" And it's a kind of funny shirt to wear around. But I thought I wrote that. I mean, I said, that's just a clever line. Then I started thinking about it. Am I artificially intelligent? And one of the things I did was I looked up the definition of the word artificial. And there are two definitions for the word artificial. Definition number 2 is fake or insincere. Definition number 1 is man-made, not natural. So I am artificially intelligent. I wasn't born with all the knowledge I somehow have managed to gain or not gain. I gained that because I happened to go to decent schools, I happen to have maybe a family that helped me out. I had mentors that helped me out. I consumed a bunch of information on the inner tubes, right? So we all have artificial intelligence in that sense. Now, that really isn't a discussion about AI at all, except the terminology we use.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure we'll talk again.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. The Future Media Podcast is a production of Future Media and Ricky Sutton.